Welcome back for another positively disturbing video. Today's video is going to gross some of you out at times. Portions of it may seem unbelievable or like a scene from a horror movie, but every one of these cases really happened. Any medical examiner will tell you that death is not glamorous. We are going to be discussing some of the most unique, shocking, and bizarre things found during post-mortem examinations. My content may be upsetting to some. Viewer discretion advised. There aren't many things that scare coroners, but this sure did. One particular day, the body of an adult male was brought in with a peculiar-looking abdomen. It was severely distended and oddly shaped. In addition to the typical X-rays utilized in a postmortem, a CT scan was ordered to get a sneak peek of the organs and soft tissue, and there was an abnormality. The images were just not enough to explain what it was. In routine fashion, the coroner began making a Y-shaped incision. It was at that moment that the man's gut began moving. Bodies can certainly move during the decomposition process, but not like that. The coroner and tech paused for a brief moment to exchange surprised glances. After a few deep breaths, the dissection continued. As she began peeling back the separated flesh, a very scared and angry snake lunged out of the abdomen like a horror movie scene. In the process, it latched onto the tech, biting them. Turns out that this man's body was found near a lake, and the snake must have burrowed in, possibly through the mouth. It slithered down the esophagus into the stomach, but the stomach couldn't hold. It blew, leaving the slithering creature free in the abdominal cavity. None of the employees at the morgue expected that their day at work would lead to a hunting expedition for a snake and a trip to the ER. The tech ended up being okay in the end. It's not unusual for coroners to receive bodies in pieces, but majority of those cases come from high-speed car crashes, aircraft disasters, and homicides. Bodies don't usually arrive that way when the death appears to be from natural causes. That is what makes this death a one-of-a-kind case. Upon arriving to the morgue to get to work for the day, this medical examiner was greeted by the body of a woman missing an arm. It wasn't completely missing. It was present. It was just no longer attached. What's even more bizarre is that the separate limb had a piece of fabric stuck on it along with a thick, gooey fluid. This fabric was weathered and had a design that you would expect to see in a 1970s home. Turns out that an officer performing a wellness check entered the woman's home to find her decaying body covered in botflies. Her home was teeming with them. Finding a robust amount of botflies in any home is a really bad omen. A decomposing body provides a perfect environment for them to lay their eggs. They tend to be most attracted to later stages of decomposition, so finding them typically means that death is present and has been present for some time. The woman's arm was positioned pressed against her couch, so when her body began liquefying, it became fused. This left the officer with a choice. Either try to carefully detach her arm from the couch or remove her for transport, couch and all. The latter was inconceivable, so they got to work. Unfortunately, her tissue had degraded too much, so in the process, her arm came clean off. Once this happened, officers worked to cut out the attached fabric from the couch to transport it along with what remained of her body. The sad truth is that this woman lived alone, died from cardiac arrest, and remained unfound until the smell prompted neighbors to call for a wellness check. This one cannot be explained. A 74-year-old male appeared to die alone in his home. There were zero signs of forced entry or foul play. His home was filled with piles of old automotive magazines, newspapers from surrounding cities, expired canned goods, and buttons. According to his neighbors, he rarely left the house and allowed mail to pile up for weeks at a time. His external examination was mostly normal. He had flat spots of discoloration caused by UV damage and aging. There was a small yellow bruise on his thigh, indicating that it was old. There was one truly peculiar characteristic found all over his body. It wasn't visible to the naked eye, but mostly with touch. There was a raised line along the sides of both legs, arms, abdomen, and chest. They extended over the shoulders, over the hips. They appeared to be two long connected lines of, well, something. They seemed to join and come to an end in the middle back of his neck. The coroner began the internal exam like normal. The main thing that stood out was the largest coronary artery. It had near a 100% blockage, which some call the widowmaker. This certainly caused a massive myocardial infarction, also known as a heart attack, where blood is blocked from flowing to the heart. So, what about the abnormality under the skin? Well, upon dissection, just beneath the outer layer of flesh was copper wire. This wire did not come from a freak accident. It appeared to be very strategically placed. There was nothing present in any records to offer up an explanation. How it got there remains a great mystery. It did not contribute to his death in any way. Can you imagine showing up to work at the morgue to find a mega-sized crocodile lying dead on a slab? This post-mortem was like a Russian doll. Okay, so maybe it didn't really unfold just like that, but in my mind it did. This examination required the help of several specialists. It was suspected that a man who had been missing was inside of the huge dead creature. In order to test this theory, they had to delicately carve into it to look for human remains that could be tested. There was already some circumstantial evidence pointing to the crocodile's guilt. There were human remains found in the vicinity where it was apprehended, and an eyewitness who claimed to see the actual attack. The amount of remains found were not substantial enough to predict death, so more was needed in order to provide loved ones closure. The coroner got to work aiding the specialists in performing a task that he was not used to performing, at least not on animals. It was important to be cautious and precise so that there was no further contamination of the potential remains. It paid off. They found exactly what they were looking for: partially digested remains of an older male. They had some bone tissue, remnants of soft tissue, and even hair. Turns out that crocodiles can digest a lot of things, but hair is not one of them. They typically regurgitate it, but it never got the chance. A full post-mortem was performed on the remains, leading to a proper identification. They did, in fact, belong to the missing man. This autopsy seemed routine enough at first. It was of an adult female who had been receiving treatment for COPD or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Truth is, you never know when things will take a bizarre turn. The external examination was unremarkable. There were areas of redness seen on the skin, which is common especially with COPD. The internal examination didn't begin too out of the ordinary. Her brain had slight atrophy in areas, meaning degeneration of cells, or in short, the tissue had shrunk slightly. Her lungs were heavy with a lot of mucus. There was fluid between the lung tissue and chest wall, typical findings with COPD. But it was the examination of the digestive tract that took a strange turn. The intestines didn't just contain remnants of human waste. There were numerous small, intact doll heads, some with pieces of hair still attached. They were like Barbie dolls, or at least the same size. Even though there was no known history of it, one can assume that she suffered from pica, where people have cravings for items that are often not food, but it will forever remain a mystery. We can only arrive at assumptions at this point, and it didn't contribute to her death in any way. A good majority of autopsies performed exhibit one of many run-of-the-mill issues, but every once in a blue moon, the medical examiner begins dissecting to find a shock of a lifetime. One coroner received the body of a deceased middle-aged woman who died while seeking care at an emergency room. There weren't any red flags on her external examination. He made the Y-shaped incision and one by one began examining her organs. Aside from a slight amount of fluid in her lungs, everything looked unremarkable, until he reached her bowels. As he carefully cut into them to take a peek around, he found something that made him feel like he was in the Twilight Zone. He couldn't believe his eyes, and frankly, it gave him a bit of a startle. Lodged deep inside of her intestines was a decaying dead mouse. Aside from the decomposition, it was still completely intact. It created a complete blockage, and further testing confirmed that it caused a catastrophic infection. He found her cause of death, but how it got there remains a mystery. I shudder at the possibilities. I can't even begin to hypothesize this one. Every medical examiner has that once-in-a-career case, and this one absolutely fits into that category. This exam was performed on a young woman whose body appeared fairly unremarkable externally. The only unusual characteristic was a distended abdomen. She had sought medical care prior to death, where some basic lab work was done and some red flags were found. She had an elevated white blood cell count, which can result from infection and/or inflammation, as well as low levels of certain electrolytes, which pointed to dehydration. The examiner performed a Y-shaped incision and began meticulously inspecting each organ. In the beginning, nothing stood out as an obvious cause of death, but it became clear that she was a very sick girl prior to death. There was a lot of congested tissue. This means that blood flow was slowed or halted, leading to it accumulating within the tissue and organs. It wasn't until they made their way to the lower half of the digestive tract that the full puzzle began coming together. A large portion of her bowel was completely impacted with hair. Upon removal, it appeared to be a perfect cast of the organ. This was a type of bezoar, which is a mass made up of undigestible materials. This one was a result of a disorder where a person compulsively plucks and ingests their own hair. The end result of the blockage is referred to as Rapunzel syndrome. The mass eventually grew to be so large that it led to a bowel obstruction. It remained untreated for long enough that the tissue became necrotic, meaning tissue death. It kicked off a deadly chain reaction which ended with a fatal systemic infection that led to multiple organ failure.